The Aichi D3A was a two-seat, single-engine dive bomber, and by the standards of the war it fought in, it looked a generation behind. The landing gear did not retract. It sat in bulky spats under a low-mounted wing, a detail that had gone out of fashion on frontline aircraft years earlier. And yet, over the first 10 months of the Pacific War, this plain-looking machine sank more Allied warships than any other Axis aircraft. It also opened the war. The first bombs to fall on Oahu on the morning of December 7, 1941, came from Type 99 dive bombers built by Aichi, 25 of them, led by Lieutenant Akira Sakamoto, off the carrier Zuikaku, went for Wheeler Field, where the Army had lined up most of the island's fighter strength in tight rows as a precaution against sabotage. From then on, the VAL, as Allied pilots would come to call it, played a leading role in every major carrier battle the Imperial Japanese Navy fought. The company that built it was called Aichi Tokei Denki Kabushiki Kaisha, which means Aichi Watch and Electric Company. There is nothing about airplanes in that name. The firm was founded in Nagoya in 1898 to make precision clocks and electrical equipment, and that is what it did for the next 20 years. Then, back in the 1920s, the company's management decided to try their hand at aircraft manufacturing. Airframe work began at the Funakata plant in Nagoya in 1920, and engines followed in 1927. The jump was less strange than it sounds. Airframes and propellers in that era were still built largely of wood, and a firm that had spent 2 decades cutting and gluing the cases of large clocks already had most of the skills the job needed. It was difficult work, and it paid. Japanese engineers had no hands-on experience with modern aircraft yet, so they brought in designers from abroad. The Germans were available, and they needed the work. The Treaty of Versailles barred Germany from building military aircraft at all, so when Ernst Heinkel opened his works at Warnemünde in 1922, he had to look abroad for contracts. Japan became one of his best customers, and then more than that. Japan sat on the Allied Commission that inspected German factories, and a naval attaché would tip Heinkel off before an inspection was due. The finished aircraft went out into the sand dunes behind the plant, and the inspectors never found them. In 1925, the German firm Heinkel landed a contract to develop a shipboard reconnaissance plane for the battleship Nagato. The Germans shipped the first HD-25 biplane to Japan by sea. It had been drawn up for catapult launching, but the Navy asked instead for a machine that could take off from a short ramp laid over a gun turret, and that is how the trials off Nagato were flown. The trials went well, and Aichi built about 16 of them under license for the Navy's warships. The arrangement worked well enough that when the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service wanted a new dive bomber, it went back to Heinkel. The order reached Warnemünde in 1931, a 2-seat machine carrying 250 kilograms of bombs, a little over 500 pounds, stressed for catapult launching, and able to work on wheels or floats. In Germany, 2 prototypes were built and flight tested, the Heinkel 50 AW floatplane and the Heinkel 50 AL landplane version. The floatplane came first in the summer of 1931 with a Junkers L5 inline that proved too weak. The landplane that followed traded the floats for wheels and the inline for a Siemens-built Jupiter Radial. Both were dive tested at Warnemünde. The next prototype, assigned the export designation Heinkel 66, was shipped to Japan in early 1933. Aichi's team, headed by Tokuichiro Gome, strengthened the landing gear to survive the punishment of carrier landings, replaced the German engine with a locally built radial, and added a second seat directly behind the pilot. It then flew against Nakajima's design and the Navy's own, and it came out steadier and easier to fly. Working from that airplane, Aichi put the Type 94 carrier dive bomber into production in 1934 as the D1A1. They built 161 D1A1 biplanes and 427 of the improved D1A2, which had a bigger engine and went into service under its own name, the Type 96. The step was from about 580 horsepower to 730, and it was the D1A2 that did most of the fighting, flying from Akagi, Kaga, and Ryujo, and from land bases in China from 1937 onward. On December 12th that year, 9 of them opened the attack on the American gunboat Panay in the Yangtze. The 18 bombs that came down around her were dropped by 3 Type 96 land attack bombers. The Pan-A sank. By 1936, Aichi engineers were already working on a next-generation carrier dive bomber to replace the aging D-1A biplanes. The requirement came down in the middle of that year as the 11 specification, and Aichi, Nakajima, and Mitsubishi all put designs forward, with the first 2 asked to build a pair of prototypes each. The new bomber would be an all-metal monoplane, and again the Germans helped. Gomei led the Aichi team once more, but most of the detail work fell to his chief assistant, Toshio Ozaki. In April 1935, Aichi had sent 3 engineers to Heinkel specifically to learn all-metal construction, Ozaki among them, and the aircraft they studied was the Heinkel 70 Blitz, a fast 4-seat airliner built for Lufthansa that first flew in December 1932 and set 8 world speed records. The Heinkel 70 was flush-riveted and aerodynamically clean, at a time when Japanese shops were still building wood and fabric over steel tube. What Ozaki brought home was less a design than a way of working. You can see Heinkel in the elliptical wing. It was more than a styling choice. That planform spreads, lift efficiently, and stalls gently rather than abruptly, which matters in an airplane flown slowly onto a pitching deck and then pulled out of a steep dive. The low-mounted wing used a NACA 23012 airfoil on 2 spars, with duralumin skin and fabric only on the ailerons and flaps. Dive brakes under the wings swung out on the way down. Each one was a pair of aluminum strips separated by a slot, and the slot mattered. It let air bleed through instead of leaving a solid wall of turbulence behind to hammer the tail. What they bought was time. At a controlled speed, the pilot had more than a second or 2 to correct his aim. That, more than anything else, is where the valve's accuracy came from. Held to a steady speed, with the fixed gear adding drag instead of shedding it, the airplane tracked down the dive line without fighting the man flying it. To save space in cramped carrier hangars, only the wingtips folded upward, hinged about 6 feet in from each tip, and the deck crews did that work by hand. The full span was a little over 47 feet, and folded, it fit on a carrier elevator. The wing carried about 375 square feet of area, a lot for an airplane that size, and that is part of why the Val could be brought aboard as slowly as it was. Empty, it weighed a little over 5,300 pounds. Loaded for a strike, it came to around 8,000. It carried roughly 280 gallons internally, none of it protected. Airplanes of this generation carried no self-sealing tanks and no armor. The gear legs sat in heavy fairings, and the designers decided the extra speed wasn't worth it. Retracting gear meant wells cut into the wing, a mechanism to work them, extra weight, and one more thing to fail on a deck landing, all for a few miles an hour. The Type 99 was the last Japanese carrier airplane built with fixed, spatted gear. Inside the oval section semi-monocoque fuselage, the pilot and rear gunner sat in tandem. They sat under a single canopy with 2 sliding sections. The man in the back also navigated and worked the radio. Up front, the pilot had 2 synchronized 7.7mm Type 97s, license copies of the British Vickers Class E, built to fire through the propeller arc. The Zero carried the same guns in its cowling. In the back, the gunner covered the tail with a 7.7mm Type 92, a Japanese version of the Lewis gun, fed from a 97-round drum on a flexible mount. Under the belly, the airplane carried a single 250-kilogram bomb. The Navy's No. 25 swung out and down on a crutch before release. Released from under the belly in a steep dive, a bomb does not simply fall away, it follows the airplane's line straight into the propeller disc, so the crutch has to push it clear of the arc first. 30 and 60-kilogram bombs could go under the wings. Under the rear fuselage, a tail hook was fitted to catch the arresting wires on a carrier deck, pulling the airplane up in 100 feet or so, a load the rear fuselage had to be built to absorb. The first prototype was finished in late 1937. It was powered by an air-cooled Nakajima Hikari 1 engine, generating 710 takeoff horsepower and driving a variable pitch propeller. In January 1938, now designated D3A1, it flew for the first time. But the flight tests turned up problems. It was underpowered. In wide turns, it wandered off heading, and in tight ones, it tended to snap roll. The brakes were the worst problem. Extended, they shook the airplane so badly that the test crews expected them to tear off the wing. The engine was swapped for a 14-cylinder Mitsubishi Kinsei 3, producing 840 takeoff horsepower. The Kinsei was Mitsubishi's twin-row radial, first run in 1934, and developed until it was making more than 1,500 horsepower by war's end. They reworked the flaps and stretched the span a little. The cowling was redesigned, the vertical tail enlarged and reshaped, the outer leading edges given washout to cure the snap roll, and the dive brakes strengthened so that they would stay attached. With those fixes, the D3A1 flew off against the Nakajima D3N1. Nakajima had built 3 prototypes to the same 11 specification and had made one decision that cost it the contract. Where Aichi left the landing gear down and fixed, Nakajima retracted it, and the result was too clean. The requirement set a diving limit of about 230 miles per hour. In a dive, the D3N1 ran up closer to 280. Aichi won. In December 1939, a production contract was signed, making the D3A1 the Navy's standard carrier dive bomber. The Navy's own name for it was the Type 99 Carrier Bomber Model 11, the number taken from the Japanese imperial calendar, in which 1939 was the year 2599. The full term, Kanjo Bakugekiki, was shortened by the men who flew it to Kanbaku. D3A1 came from a separate scheme borrowed from the Americans. D for carrier bomber, 3 for the third, such design accepted, A for Aichi. The production airplane was not quite the prototype. It had the 1,000-horsepower Kinsei 43 and a dorsal fin extension that finally settled it down. The first 6 production aircraft were tested aboard the carriers Akagi and Kaga, and the crews liked it. Some went to China and Indochina, flying from land. The type had gone into action a month before the Navy formally accepted it, when early aircraft reached the 14th Air Group at Haiku on Hainan, and supported the Army's capture of Nanning, cutting the supply route up from French Indochina. The 12th Air Group converted in May 1940 and flew against Yichang, the river traffic on the Yangtze, and from September, Chongqing. Through late 1940, D3A1s were going to the 1st Air Fleet, the force that would open the war against the United States. That formation had been created on April 10, 1941, gathering every fleet carrier under one command so that their air groups could be massed into a single strike. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo took over the same day, with Akagi and Kaga in the 1st Carrier Division and Hiryu and Soryu in the 2nd. The newest pair, Shokaku and Zuikaku, joined later that year as the 5th Carrier Division. Zuikaku was not commissioned until September 1941. They worked out of airfields in Kyushu through the spring and summer, diving at 50 to 60 degrees, and Lieutenant Commander Takashige Agusa, who ran the dive bomber training, pushed the release altitude down to about 1,300 feet to tighten the pattern. On November 22, 1941, the fleet assembled in the Kuril Islands and set course for Hawaii. The anchorage was Hitokapu Bay on Etorofu, remote, usually under fog, and empty of the merchant traffic that might have reported it. About 30 ships lay in it, and they took a northern route clear of the shipping lanes, refueling at sea and holding radio silence the whole way. When Admiral Nagumo's strike force closed in on Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, the 6 carriers had 135 D3A1s aboard, along with Type 97 torpedo bombers and Zeros. The ships turned into the wind, and by 6 in the morning the first wave was off the decks, 51 D3A1s among them. Those 51 were led by Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi, and they were not sent against ships. Each carried one 250-kilogram high-explosive bomb, the land attack type rather than the armor-piercing bomb used against warships, and their targets were the aircraft parked at Wheeler Field, at Hickam Field, and at the seaplane base on Ford Island. The battleships belonged to the torpedo bombers. The dive bombers were there to see that nothing got airborne to interfere. At Wheeler, the fighters burned in their rows, and at Hickam, the bombers went the same way. Almost nothing got into the air. An hour later, the second wave went, another 78 dive bombers among them. These were Agusas. When the battleship Nevada got underway for the harbor entrance, 14 to 18 of them came down on her and put 5 bombs into her shortly after 9. Fuchida radioed Nagumo the code words, Tora, Tora, Tora. Surprise attack successful. Rear Admiral Kusaka, the fleet's chief of staff, had put it this way. The operation should come with the swiftness of a passing demon and be gone like a gust of wind. By 9:45 in the morning, it was all over. In 2 hours, the United States lost its Pacific battleship fleet, about 190 aircraft, and 2,400 lives. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft, 15 of them D3A ones. The name Val came out of an intelligence office in Australia. In mid-1942, Captain Frank McCoy, who ran the Materiel and Intelligence section of Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific at Melbourne, began handing out short reporting names, men's names for fighters and women's names for bombers. The Type 99 became Val. The Type 97 torpedo bomber became Kate. Top speed was about 240 miles an hour. It took the better part of 7 minutes to reach 10,000 feet and topped out somewhere near 31,000. None of that is impressive, and it kept hitting things anyway. With zeros overhead, the Val crews had almost nothing to worry about. The Allies were flying Buffaloes, Wildcats, and Hurricanes, and none of them could climb with a zero. On February 19, 1942, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu hit the naval and air base at Darwin in northern Australia. The strike put 188 aircraft over the town, 71 of them Vals. 8 ships were sunk in the harbor, among them the American destroyer Peary. Many of the 35 others were damaged, and 236 people were killed. An hour behind the carrier aircraft came a second raid by land-based bombers, and the port was out of use for months. Shortly after, the first air fleet appeared off the coast of Ceylon. On April 5th, they went for Colombo. Most of the British Eastern Fleet was not there to receive them, Admiral Somerville having moved it to the secret anchorage at Adu Atoll. 38 D3A1s and 53 Kates went in against what was left in the harbor. The armed merchant cruiser Hector burned for hours before she settled. The old destroyer Tenedos sank quickly, taking 33 men with her, and a handful of auxiliaries went with them. The dockyard and the railway workshops were hit as well. 21 Hurricanes of No. 30 Squadron got off the ground at Ratmalana before the first bombs fell, and the Zeros bounced them and cut them up badly. A few hours later, on the same afternoon, 53 D3A1s launched against the British heavy cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall, 300 miles south of Colombo. A float plane from the heavy cruiser Tone had found them around midday, and Agusa led the strike sent after them. Japanese accounts put the hit rate for the Indian Ocean raid at 82%. Inside 20 minutes, both cruisers were gone, Dorsetshire first and Cornwall about 10 minutes behind her. Dorsetshire had put the last torpedoes into the Bismarck less than a year earlier. More than 1,100 men came off the 2 ships and spent close to 30 hours in the water before the British cruiser Enterprise and 2 destroyers found them. On April 9th, the Japanese caught a small British force off Trincomalee. 85 Vals came down on them with 250-kilogram bombs. Hermes was the first ship in the world designed from the outset as an aircraft carrier, and that morning she was steaming with no aircraft aboard and no fighter cover. Close to 40 bombs hit her. The destroyer Vampire took 16, and 4 other ships were hit as well. All of them were sunk. Hermes went down with 307 men, including her captain, Richard Onslow. The hospital ship Vita picked up several hundred survivors. Those 4 were the corvette Hollyhock, the tanker British Sergeant, and the auxiliaries Athelstane and Norvikin. The Allies recovered from those first defeats. On May 7th and 8th came the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first time the Japanese were stopped. Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Shoho on one side, Yorktown and Lexington on the other. 33 Vals went in as part of a combined strike, 19 of them against Lexington and 14 against Yorktown. 2 bombs went into Lexington, along with 2 torpedoes from the Kates in the same attack, and she seemed to have absorbed all of it until leaking gasoline vapor ignited below decks hours afterward. Her crew abandoned her that evening, and the destroyer Phelps put torpedoes into her to finish it. The same attack drove an armor-piercing bomb through 5 of Yorktown's decks, killing or badly wounding 66 men. But the Japanese took heavy losses as well. Shoho was hit so many times on the 7th that she sank in minutes, and Shokaku was left badly damaged. 2 bombs from Yorktown's dive bombers and a third from Lexington's group wrecked her flight deck beyond any hope of launching aircraft. She made Kure on her own and went straight into dock. This was the first time the Japanese dive bomber crews ran into real opposition, and it cost them. 90 Japanese aircrew died across the 2 days, and with Shokaku in the yard and Zuikaku's air group gutted, neither ship was available a month later when it would have counted most. That was Midway. On June 4th, American forces sank 4 of Japan's fleet carriers in a single day: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. Along with the ships, the First Air Fleet lost aircrew it could not spare, the same men who had flown the Pearl Harbor strike. The count was 110 airmen, just under a quarter of the aircrew aboard the 4 carriers. Airframes could be replaced in weeks. These men could not. The larger hole was in the ships themselves and in the flight deck, crews, armorers, and mechanics who went down with them. Japan could build airplanes. It could not build 4 fleet carriers again, and it could not replace the people who had learned to run them. Japan had begun the war with roughly 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrew and never widened the pipeline meant to replace them. With the carriers gone, most of the surviving dive bombers went to shore bases. The VALs were not finished, though. On August 24, 1942, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, about 30 dive bombers from Shokaku and Zuikaku found the carrier Enterprise. 3 bombs hit her and 4 fell close alongside, killing 74 men and wounding 95. But she kept steaming and kept operating aircraft. Her repair parties had the flight deck usable again inside an hour. Shokaku's squadron came home missing 10 VALs and 5 escorting fighters, and 61 Japanese aircrew were lost that day. 2 months later came the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. On October 26th, VALs put 3 bombs into Hornet inside about 15 minutes, and one of them, shot to pieces on the run-in, crashed into her island structure and spilled burning gasoline across the deck. A second wave of 19 dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seki, who had also led the attack at the Eastern Solomons, hit Enterprise twice. Seki was killed. Hornet was abandoned that night and finished off in the dark by Japanese destroyers. The Japanese lost 99 of the 203 aircraft they committed and 148 aircrew, more than at Coral Sea, Midway, or the Eastern Solomons. Among the dead were 2 dive bomber group leaders, 3 torpedo squadron leaders, and 18 other section and flight leaders. Aichi went to work on keeping the airplane useful a while longer. Earlier production VALs had the Kinsey 44, rated at 1,070 takeoff horsepower. That gave way to the 1,300 horsepower Kinsey 54. Fuel went up by about 20 gallons, but the new engine drank more, and the extra tankage only partly offset it. Range came out near 840 miles, still short of what the D3A-1 had managed. It still had no self-sealing tanks and no armor for the crew. The fuel sat in bare wing tanks, and the men sat behind nothing, at a point when the American fighters the VAL was meeting carried 650 cals apiece. The result was the D3A-2. You could pick it out by the longer canopy and a new propeller spinner. Top speed rose to 267 miles an hour, and that was not enough. In 1943, 267 was still slow. Some were fitted with 20mm cannon for low-level sweeps over New Guinea and the Solomons. By then, most of the VAL's work was land-based, flying out of Rabaul against American shipping off Guadalcanal, and the losses ran ahead of anything the training schools could make up. D3A-2 production began in August 1942 at the Funakata plant, where about 470 D3A-1s had been built up to that point. Late that year, Showa Hikoki Kogyo in Tokyo started building them too. Aichi's shops would deliver 815 of the new machines, and the Tokyo contractor 201. The new bombers began reaching frontline units that fall, but by then Japan was already building a far more modern dive bomber, the D4Y Suisei, developed at the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal. The Allies called it Judy. The Judy was close to 100 miles an hour faster and carried its bomb inside the fuselage. The Navy put the new Judy aboard its surviving fleet carriers and pushed the older VALs down to the escort decks. The trouble was that the Suisei came aboard fast, and a fast approach onto a short deck is a hard thing to survive. The Hiyo-class ships that made up much of what Japan had left after Midway had been laid down as passenger liners. They were slower than the fleet carriers and their decks were shorter, so the fixed-gear Val stayed aboard. The 653rd Air Group, formed in March 1944 for Junyo, Hiyo, and Ryuho, still flew D3A2s. Most D3A2s went to shore-based air groups. The Val's last day on a carrier deck lasted one afternoon. On June 19, 1944, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, 27 D3A2s flew in an 84-plane raid launched from Junyo, Hiyo, Ryuho, and Zuikaku. American radar caught the formations while they were still assembling, and very little came back from what the Americans were already calling the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The next afternoon, American aircraft found the fleet and sank Hiyo. By then, Allied fighters had the Val beaten in speed, climb, firepower, and protection, and the number of them still flying was shrinking fast. In early 1944, some D3A2s went to training units as the D3A2K, fitted with dual controls and flown as Navy Type 99 bomber trainers. The ones still on the line kept working, and the Val units were wiped out over the Philippines that autumn. From late October 1944, many of them went out as suicide aircraft, beginning with the 2nd Kamikaze Special Attack Unit on the 27th. American pilots and sailors kept running into these outdated Vals right up to the end of the war. The kamikaze units flew whatever they had left, and that included Vals. On April 16, 1945, the destroyer USS Laffey fought off a raid by 22 kamikazes with corsairs overhead. She was alone on Okinawa Radar Picket Station No. 1, and the action ran for 80 minutes. 7 of the aircraft shot down that day were Vals. 6 got through and hit her, and 4 bombs went in on top of that. Laffey was towed off and anchored off Okinawa the next day. She went to Saipan for temporary repairs and then on to Seattle, and she never fought again in that war. 32 of her 336 men were killed and 71 wounded, and she survives today as a museum ship at Patriots Point. Aichi's line closed in June 1944, and Showa kept building D3A2s until August 1945. Imperial Japanese Navy Aviation received about 470 D3A1s and 1,016 D3A2s. Not one complete example survives. What exists came out of the jungle. 1 D3A2 under restoration at the Plains of Fame Museum in California, and 2 unrestored airframes in Texas. The Val's career tracked the Junkers U-87 Stukas almost exactly. The Val worked over open water, the Stuka worked over land. Germany built something on the order of 6,500 Stukas against fewer than 1,500 Vals. By mid-war, the air belonged to the Allies, and both airplanes became easy targets. Slow, fixed-gear machines were shot down in numbers, and both types came off the front line. The Stuka got there first, pulled out of the daylight battle over Britain in August 1940 after a week of losses to Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Val kept going longer, largely because Japan had nothing else that could come aboard the small decks. Both airplanes were built around the same idea, that a bomb aimed by pointing the whole airplane at the target would hit more often than one let go from level flight at height. Both were right about that, and both were overtaken by fighters. The Val's best months were its first ones. That is where the record comes from, more Allied warships on the bottom than any other Axis airplane put there. It was out of date the day it entered service, and for 10 months it was the most dangerous airplane in the Pacific.